Okay. Hello. Welcome to PY 2222 PY 3222. Made to think of Sartre. So what I want to do today, really, is just run through some of the content of the course and talk to you about why Sartre is an important figure to study, and then talk a little bit about the novel I asked you to read over Christmas. And that novel is Nausea by Sartre. So that's one of his really early works. Okay. So the focus of the course is going to be Jean-Paul Sartre, who's perhaps the most famous French philosopher of the 20th century, and who founded one of the most important movements of the 20th century, which is the Existentialist movement. Now, Sartre wrote works in pretty much every form of writing. So he's written traditional philosophical writings, essays, reviews, plays, novels, all kinds of things. So we're going to be focusing on a mixture of those, predominantly philosophical texts, because this is a philosophy course. But I've given you, I've given you Sartre's novel to start, Nausea, and later on we're going to be looking at one of his most famous plays, Huis Clos. So we'll look at a range of works by Sartre, and we're also going to look at his works right from the beginning of his philosophical development. So next week we'll be looking at one of his earliest philosophical works, the Sketch for the Theory of the Emotions, right through to the Critique of Dialectical Reason, which was Sartre's last really major work that he didn't complete it, but he completed the first volume, and there's a full draft of the second volume. So we'll look at his entire career. Now, like I say, his work runs through the 20th century. He's born in 1905 and he dies in 1980, and he's what's known as an existential philosopher. So he argues that, unlike other things we find in the world, our own natures, or our essence as it is, precedes is determined by our existence. So everything else in the world, you'll find that its essence precedes its existence. So what it is, and what it's meant to be, what it can do, the meaning of it, comes before it's actually brought into being, on a classical conception of the world. So if you think about like a hammer, we have the idea of a hammer before we bring it into existence. We kind of have a plan of it and then we produce it. And classically, we understand nature in the same way. We understand nature as purposive, as being brought into existence, or having a particular purpose that defines its existence. Now, what Sartre is going to claim is that human beings aren't structured in that way. So we don't have an essence or a purpose before we come into being. Now that means that we're essentially free. We exist before our nature's defined. But it also means that there are going to be no guiding principles to govern our existence. So, if you think about a hammer, you can tell a good hammer from a bad hammer, because a bad hammer doesn't let you hammer things, whereas a good hammer does. Whereas if we come into being before our essence is defined, then there are going to be no guiding principles by which we can tell a good life from a bad life. Now, what that means is that while we're radically free for Sartre, that radical freedom is combined with a kind of radical anxiety about the kind of person we should be. Okay, so we're going to begin the course by looking at Sartre's really early works. And these deal with a whole range of things. Predominantly they deal with, I would say, contingency and the absurd. That's what we're going to encounter in Nausea. The nature of the emotions and the way in which the emotions define the way in which we see the world. And the imagination, and particularly the imagination insofar as the imagination provides a way of organising or making sense of our experience of the world. Now, each of the texts we're going to look at on this first part of the course develops a theme that's going to be integral to Sartre's later work. And we'll see how these later themes develop when we look at being and nothingness later in the course. And what you'll see is that these themes that are kind of quite specific to areas of inquiry in the early work kind of get transformed into systematic claims about human experience. So there's a really interesting movement that's going to happen between these first few weeks and what happens later on. Okay, so the first text we're going to look at is Nausea. And as I say, this addresses really the question of of contingency in existence. Now, I'll come back to what that means in a minute. But as you'll have seen when you've read the novel, Sartre is very keen throughout to explore the different ways in which we attempt to see our lives as meaningful. And there are a whole range of ways in which we do this through bourgeois morality, through the ways that we relate to other people, through a privileging of knowledge of existence, or through, for instance, reminiscence. Now, in each of these cases, what we find is that Quentin, who's the hero of the novel, discovers behind these attempts to structure meaning a moment of sheer contingency or absurdity of his existence. So he tries to cover over this moment with these structures, but finds he's unable to do so. So in a sense, when we look at Nausea, we'll see it's kind of like a philosophical detective novel, with the idea of existence being without a purpose being the culprit that's discovered by Quentin through the novel. You know, he has this moment of nausea, and throughout the whole novel he's trying to figure out what this nausea is. So the idea of contingency here ties into Sartre's claim elsewhere. And if you've come across his early essay, Existentialism as a Humanism, this is where he famously makes the claim. His claim elsewhere that all existentialism is an attempt to found a consistent atheism. Okay, so that's the first work we'll look at, Nausea. That's what we're looking at today. Then we're going to move on and look at the sketch for the theory of the emotions. Now, what Sartre does here is he develops an account of the emotions that sees them as responses to situations where our rational ways of engaging with the world are thwarted. So what Sartre is doing here is he's kind of trying to show how much of our experience of the world is fundamentally irrational. And he's also trying to bring in themes that we'll see are really important in his later work, about how our mental lives are shrouded in a kind of self-deception. Okay, the last of the early works we're going to look at are two works on the nature of the imagination. Now we're going to look at selections from both of these. They're quite long together, so we'll just look at a selection of the works. And they were originally written as 2 volumes of the same piece of work, but the publisher thought it would be too long, so the first part was published, The Imagination, and The Imaginary he published later when he became more famous. So the first part, The Imagination, is really Sartre's critique and analysis of traditional accounts of what the imagination is. Now, as we'll see, Sartre's going to be really keen to show that when we're imagining, the way in which we relate to images is fundamentally different to when we're perceiving. So if you've read Hume, David Hume, for instance, you'll know that Hume believes that there's really just a difference in degree between imagining something, you know, imagining the Parthenon in Athens, and perceiving it. There's just a difference in degree there. Now, what Sartre's going to argue is that there's a difference in kind between the nature of perception and imagination. So that the major part of that early work is refuting this kind of associationist account of imagination. Now, what the imaginary does then is it goes on to develop Sartre's positive account of the imagination. Now, what we'll see is at the heart of this account is the claim that imagined objects aren't a different kind of mental image, So it's not like in our heads we've got perceptions and imaginings. Rather, imagining and perceiving aren't really in the head at all. They're different ways of relating to objects in the world. Okay, so I'm looking at my laptop now. Now, when I turn away and I imagine my laptop, then it's not the case for Sartre that when I'm doing this over here, looking over here, that there's a different image in my head. In both cases, looking at the laptop and imagining it, the same object is being related to, but the way in which I relate to it differs between those two. So that means that thinking, perceiving, imagining, all of these things come out from being activities that are in the head for Sartre, and they become ways in which we relate to objects in the world. Now, what that means is if imagining is an important part of our relationship to the world, and it can relate to things that aren't present, that means that our lives aren't simply governed causally by the things around us, but are also governed by things that are not present to us at that moment. And that's going to be really important, because it's going to show that the sense we make of the world transcends what's actually given to us at any moment. And this is going to be the basis for Sartre's claim that we're free. Okay. So in each of those cases, we can see that what Sartre is doing is he's really trying to explore our relationship to the world insofar as it extends outside of the normal rational boundaries by which we understand the world. So we'll talk about nausea more in a minute, but for now I just want to give you a quote from the book, quite a long quote, and to talk about its significance in terms of philosophical inquiry. So this quote it's one of the more, the less literary and more philosophical sections of Nausea, but it really does set out, I think, some of the moves that Sartre is making that are really central around how we reconceive what existence is. So here's what he says. He says, "Never until these last few days had I understood the meaning of existence. I was like the others, like the ones walking along the seashore, all dressed in their spring finery. I said like them, the ocean is green, that the white speck up there is a seagull, but I didn't feel that it existed, or that the seagull was an existing seagull. Usually existence hides itself. It's there around us, in us, it is us. You can't say two words without mentioning it, but you can never touch it. When I believed I was thinking about it, I must believe that I was thinking nothing, my head was empty, or that there was just one word in my head, the word to be. Or else I was thinking, how can I explain it? I was thinking of belonging. I was telling myself that the sea belonged to the class of green objects, or that green was a part of the quality of the sea. Even when I looked at things, I was miles from dreaming that they existed. They looked like scenery to me. I picked them up in my hands, they served as tools, I foresaw their resistance. But that all happened on the surface. If anyone had asked me what existence was, I would have answered in good faith that it was nothing, simply an empty form which was added to external things without changing anything in their nature. And then all of a sudden, there it was, clear as day. Existence had suddenly unveiled itself. It had lost the harmless look of an abstract category. It was the very paste of things. This root was kneaded into existence. Or rather, the root, the park gates, the bench, the sparse grass, all that had vanished. The diversity of things, their individuality, were only an appearance, a veneer. The veneer had melted, leaving soft, monstrous masses, all in disorder, naked in a frightful, obscene nakedness. Okay. So, I'll talk about why existentialism is called existentialism in a minute. But we can see here where the term existentialism comes from. I'll talk about that in a sec. So we can note a number of things about this account. The first is that Sartre is offering a description of experience here. Now, when we look at Sartre's work, and we'll see this all through the course, we'll find that he does use a lot of traditional philosophical arguments, but a lot of the weight of his philosophical position is covered by descriptions of experience like this one. Now, this has got its basis firstly in the fact that he's a phenomenologist. He takes up Edmund Husserl's notion of phenomenology, and Husserl tries to found the sciences, tries to develop a new way of doing philosophy by focusing on a precise description of experience. So that's the foundation of the philosophical method for Husserl, describing very precisely the nature of experience. And Sartre's following Husserl to a large extent here. So Sartre will claim that he's a phenomenologist. Second, Sartre's use of descriptions of experience allow him to build a philosophical account of the world that doesn't take reason as its fundamental characteristic. So it might be that when we look at experience, we find that the structures of reason don't adequately capture the ways in which we understand the world. Now, the passage I've read here, should show this quite clearly. Sartre here is describing Requentin's encounter with existence. Now, the point he wants to make here is that the way we encounter existence is not the same as the way in which we talk about it. Now, as I said earlier, you can see in this passage where the idea of existentialism comes from. And with Requentin's analysis of his experience of the park, I think it's very clear why existentialism is called existentialism. And the reason is that it posits that the way in which we know the world is not the same as the way in which we kind of exist within the world. So you can see here that the categories of knowledge show themselves to be simply inadequate to the way in which Requentin experiences the world in this moment of nausea. And it kind of implies here that even though we often cover over this experience of existence, underneath what we're actually thinking and knowing about the world is this incommensurable relation between us and it that is fundamentally determined by us just being in the world. So existentialism is an analysis of what it is to exist without taking for granted that existence coincides with the categories of knowledge that we would use to talk about existence. Okay, so Sartre here gives two examples of the way in which we might talk about existence in conventional terms. So the first of these is how we understand the nature of existence itself. Now, Sartre here argues that conventionally, or suggests, or Requentin suggests, that conventionally existence is an empty term. So he says, it's there around us, in us, it is us. You can't say two words without mentioning it, but you can never touch it. When I believed I was thinking about it, I must believe that I was thinking nothing. My head was empty, or there was just one word in my head, to be. Now, I'm guessing you've all taken the Kant course, and you'll remember that when you and I looked at Kant's account of God and the proofs for the existence of God, the key claim Kant made, or one of the key claims, is that existence isn't a property. It's not a characteristic of things. It's merely a way of thinking the relationship between our concepts and objects we encounter in the world. Now that means that for Kant, existence is kind of empty of content. And I think that's kind of what Sartre is getting at here. So if you remember rightly, Kant says the following. He says, thus when I think a thing through whichever and however many predicates I like, even in its thoroughgoing determination, not the least bit gets added to the thing when I posit in addition that this thing is. For otherwise, what would exist would not be the same as what I thought in my concept, but more than that, and I could not say that the very object of my concept exists. Okay, so that's Kant's version of the same claim. So we can see that the view that Sartre is kind of opposing here has a very long philosophical lineage. Okay, now the other existence we can think of is not the existence of things, but the existence of properties that we find around us. Now Sartre describes their existence as follows. He says, or else was I thinking, how can I explain it? I was thinking of belonging. I was telling myself that the sea belonged to the class of green objects, or that the green was a part of the quality of the sea. Even when I looked at things, I was miles from dreaming that they existed. They looked like scenery to me. I picked them up in my hands, they served as tools. I foresaw their resistance. Okay. So here we can see Sartre arguing that we traditionally understand qualities in terms of the uses that we make of things and also in logical terms. Now, as Sartre is arguing here, to be green is to belong to the class of green objects. Now, what Sartre is describing instead of this, and what Requentin's describing, is a direct and visceral encounter with the world where we see the existence of things beyond our categories of thought and beyond our kind of pragmatic concerns. So Sartre is pointing here to the contingent and radically inhuman nature of the world once we see it apart from our kind of personal concerns with it. Now, given logical structure covers over this immediate relationship with existence, it should be clear why Sartre sees literature as a way of bypassing that kind of logical structure to present existence more clearly. And we can note that, as we'll see when we look at Sketch for a Theory of the Emotions, Sartre is likewise concerned with the ways in which our emotional lives provide a way of engaging with the world outside of a kind of purely rational framework. And we're going to see a similar interest driving the imagination, or the account of the imagination. And it's going to be used, the imagination is going to be used to similarly develop an account of what leads us to act, which is not going to be based on reason in the same way as, say, a rationalist account would be. And it's going to form the heart of what we discover in Sartre's middle works, which is primarily the work Being and Nothingness. Okay. So Being and Nothingness then. So we're going to look at Being and Nothingness. It's going to be the major text we're going to look at over the course. And this is the text where Sartre really takes the themes of the early work and coordinates them into a systematic vision of the relationship between human beings and the world. Now, as we're going to see, at the heart of Sartre's account here is the claim that we're thrown into the world, and that while we don't choose where we're thrown into the world, or our own existence even, we're nonetheless responsible for the ways in which we make sense of the world and we organise the world. Now, Sartre argues that there are no principles that we can use to determine how we should live. But as I say, we're nonetheless responsible for the existence we hold, for the principles we take up. Now, that means that as well as being free, Sartre is going to argue that we attempt to escape from the fact that our situation is of our own choosing by entering into bad faith. So we try and remove this sense that we're free by seeing our actions as justified, or seeing ourselves as determined by the situations we find ourselves in. Now, when we go through being and nothingness, we're going to really focus on two themes. We're going to explore Sartre's account of freedom, and we're going to look at how this account emerges from his work on other people. From his account of our relations with other people. Now, when you've looked at Nausea, you'll have seen that other people have a very, minor role. So there's the autodidact, and there's, the woman in the cafe he sleeps with, and then there's Annie at the end. So there are all of these characters, but they sort of feel inessential to what's going on, and it's really about Quentin, isolated alone in this industrial city. Now, in the Second World War, Sartre was conscripted into the army, and he had to obviously live in a barracks with other people, and he starts to formulate there a more integral account of our relations with others. Now, we'll also see that Sartre's account of our relations with other people is quite a radical account. So he holds that philosophy traditionally has understood our relationships with others in terms of knowledge, how we know that other people exist, for instance. And he argues that that kind of account is fundamentally flawed. Now, the reason there's a problem with that is because if we think about our relations with others and our knowledge of others as being based on some kind of inference, for instance, by saying that there's an analogy between my body and your body, so therefore I infer that you have a mind like I have a mind, then if we take it based on an inference, then our knowledge of other people will be probable. But as Sartre says, phenomenologically, our feeling is that other people exist with certainty. So there's a phenomenological, a sort of an error in the experience of other people if we take knowledge to be the foundation of our understanding of them. Now, Sartre is instead going to argue that we don't infer other people's existence, but that they're recognised immediately. So the key experience here, one of the key experiences, will be shame. So when we feel shame, we don't know the other person exists through an inference, but because we suddenly see ourselves from another person's point of view. We see ourselves caught in a shameful action, or pride, if you're more positive. We, in both cases, our orientation to ourselves suddenly takes into account other people in a way that it hadn't before. So when we're looking at Sartre's account of the other, we're going to make a detour to look at another text by Sartre, which is his play Huis Clos. And that's an important work where three people are trapped in hell together, and the conclusion, or the key claim for the play, the most famous line is that hell is other people. So hell just is these three people being trapped in their relationships with each other with no way of escaping from them. So no like toasting of feet under fires or pitchforks. It's just being in relations with other people. That's hell. Okay. So the final text we're going to look at is the Critique of Dialectical Reason. Now, Sartre is a massively prolific writer, and there's a whole range of stuff that we're not going to be able to look at on the course that I'd really love to look at. So I'd really like to look at some of Sartre's biographical works. So he writes on the 19th century novelist Flaubert, for instance. It's like a massive 3-volume study. There's a text on Jean Genet, who is a thief playwright in the 20th century. And there's a brilliant biography of Baudelaire, although it's quite poorly translated, unfortunately. But we're not going to be able to look at any of those. I just wanted to signal that there is this wider range of texts. But we're going to be looking at the last major work that Sartre wrote, which is the Critique of Dialectical Reason. Now, what Sartre is trying to do in this text is develop a theory of society on the basis of his existential philosophy. Now, you'll have seen already through looking at Nausea that Sartre's philosophy is very, very individualistic. So what the critique of dialectical reason tries to do is synthesize this individualistic philosophy with a Marxist attempt to develop an ethics. So it's a massive work, and he was doing lots of amphetamines when he wrote it because he was coming to the end of his life and he really wanted to finish it. So it's also, as you might expect, quite repetitive in points. So what we're going to look at is a series of selections from the critique of dialectical reason. And I'll put those up on Moodle at some point in the next few weeks. Okay. So for the rest of the lecture, I really want to just outline some of the texts that I asked you to look at over the holidays, which was Nausea. And this is one of the earliest works that Sartre wrote, and it's also one of those texts that kind of pushed him from being a minor academic to being a literary figure. Now, you'll see that the plot is presented in the form of a diary written by Requentin during his stay in this industrial town called Beauville, where he's writing this book on the Marquis de Rollebon. Now, as I say, the novel's structured a little bit like a detective novel, and the culprit that Requentin is really looking for is the contingency of existence. So as the novel progresses, Requentin recognises the impossibility of finding a justification for his own existence, or for any of his projects, and finally he decides to give up this project of writing history and to move to Paris and begin a novel. Now, there are obvious parallels with Sartre's life here, given Sartre himself taught in a small industrial town before returning to Paris to find himself, to develop his career as a novelist and writer. We can also point out that there are obviously contradictions in the idea of presenting the contingency of existence in a novel. A novel has a definite structure. It's got a beginning and an end. It's got a certain mode of organisation. But the whole point is to highlight the way in which existence lacks a kind of necessary mode of organisation. So there's a certain paradox that you'll have noticed, I hope, or may have noticed in understanding the contingency of existence through a work that has a kind of necessary structure like a novel. But nevertheless, as I said at the start of this lecture, the format of the novel allows Sartre to develop his worldview through description rather than the more classical philosophical argument. Okay. Okay, so I think we can get a sense of what Sartre is talking about in this novel by contrasting the two experiences of contingency and necessity that really run through the book. And I think these provide the framework to understand the novel. So the first of these occurs near the end of the book, and it's the experience of the tree in the park, and it's probably the most famous passage from the novel. And the other, the experience of necessity, is the listening to the jazz record, which is also a really famous moment from the text. So, as I say, when he's listening to the jazz record, we see an example of necessity in the sense that the elements of the music all work together and kind of transcend the contingency of existence. All right, well, let's start with contingency then. Here's the example of contingency. The word absurdity is coming to life under my pen. A little while ago, in the garden, I couldn't find it, but neither was I looking for it. I didn't need it. I thought without words, on things, with things. Absurdity was not an idea in my head or the sound of a voice. Only this long serpent dead at my feet, this wooden serpent. The serpent or claw or root or vulture's talon, what difference does it make? Without formulating anything clearly, I understood that I'd found the key to existence, the key to my nauseas, to my own life. This route, there was nothing in relation to which it was absurd. Oh, how can I put it in words? Absurd in relation to the stones, the tufts of yellow grass, the dry mud, the tree, the sky, the green benches. Absurd, irreducible, nothing, not even a profound secret upheaval of nature could explain it. Evidently, I did not know everything. I had not seen the seed sprout or the tree grow, but faced with this great wrinkled paw, neither ignorance nor knowledge was important. The world of explanations and reasons is not the world of existence. A circle is not absurd. It is clearly explained by the rotation of a straight segment around one of the extremities. But neither does a circle exist. This route, on the other hand, existed in such a way that I could not explain it. Knotty, inert, nameless, it fascinated me, filled my eyes, brought me back unceasingly to its own existence. In vain to repeat, this is a route. In vain to repeat, this is a route. It did not work anymore. I saw clearly that you could not pass from its function as a route, as a breathing pump, to this hard, compact skin of a sea lion, to this oily, callous, headstrong look. The function explained nothing. It allowed you to understand generally that it was a route, but not one at all. But not that one at all. This route, with its colour, shape, its congealed movement, was below all explanation. Each of its qualities escaped a little, flowed out of it, half solidified, almost became a thing. Each one was in the way in the route. And the whole stump now gave me the impression of unwinding itself a little, denying its existence, to lose itself in a frenzied excess. Okay, so this here is the account of the inexplicable, unjustifiable nature of existence. Ultimately, it's the recognition of this absurdity at the heart of existence that threatens all of Requentin's projects in the novel. Now, I want to talk in a minute about the ways in which Requentin tries to escape from this feeling of absurdity. But before then, there's an experience of necessity present in the text that counteracts this absurdity. So whenever he experiences this moment of necessity, the feeling of absurdity falls away from him. Now, this is a work of art represented by the jazz record, and here's Requentin's description of it. Okay, a few more seconds and the Negress will sing. It seems inevitably, so strong is the necessity of this music, nothing can interrupt it. Nothing which comes from this time in which the world has fallen. It will stop itself as if by order. If I love this beautiful voice, it is especially because of that. It is neither for its fullness nor its sadness. Rather because it is the event for which so many notes have been preparing, from so far away, dying that it might be born. And yet I am troubled. It would take so little to make the record stop, a broken spring, a whim of cousin Adolphe. How strange it is, how moving, that this hardness should be so fragile. Nothing can interrupt it, yet all can break it. The last chord has died away. In a brief silence which follows, I feel strongly that there it is, that something has happened. Some of these days you'll miss me, honey. What has just happened is that the nausea has disappeared. When the voice was heard in the silence, I felt my body harden and the nausea vanish. Suddenly, it was almost unbearable to become so hard, so brilliant. At the same time, the music was drawn out, dilated, swelled like a waterspout. It filled the room with its magnetic transparency, crushing our miserable time against the walls. I am in the music. Globes of fire turn in the mirrors, encircled by rings of smoke, veiling and unveiling the hard smile of light. My glass of beer has shrunk. It seems heaped up on the table. It looks dense and indispensable. When I pick it up and feel the weight of it, I stretch out my hand. God, that is what has changed my gestures. This movement of my arm has developed like a majestic theme. It has glided along the song of the negress. I seem to be dancing. Okay, so what we've got here is an alternative to understanding the world in terms of contingency. So when we think of a melody, each of the notes only makes sense in terms of the music as a whole. So each note is justified by its relations to the other notes around it. And we can see that the jazz tune is very much a human creation. It has a purpose. And it represents a kind of order that's entirely transparent. And even as Sartre suggests here, it reasserts the human world more broadly. So the glass in front of Quentin once again becomes a practical object tied to our aims and our ambitions. Now, the other thing to note about the jazz record is that there's a certain important sense in which it's outside of existence. So Sartre talks about the world as being fallen, whereas the jazz record has this kind of sense of being prior to this fall. And he says here that the playing of the record can be broken. The record can be broken, the sound can be broken, but it can't be interrupted. In a sense, it's outside of time. And he talks elsewhere about, there being a scratch on the record, but the way in which the scratch somehow isn't able to incorporate itself into the music. The scratch on the record feels external to the time of the music itself. So the music, given it has this transparent self-organisation, provides some kind of respite from the absurd. It's a structure that's fully organised. And this probably explains Requentin's final move in the text, which is a desire to leave Beauville and write a novel. So this movement back towards art. Okay. Okay, so we can see Nausea is in large part addressing the different ways in which we try and escape from contingency by trying to trying to find a grounding for our lives. So I just want to run through a few of these ways here in which Nausea talks about ways in bad faith that we attempt to find some necessity in a world of contingency. Now, the first is the notion of adventures. So Sartre or Requentin, both of them, consider the possibility of giving meaning to the world by seeing the world as full of these adventures. Now, ultimately, the claim is that adventures are artificial, and in a sense, they only really have meaning within the literary world. In the real world, adventures are not real things. And Requentin talks quite early on about how he's lost the ability to recount the stories of his lives because he's no longer forced to understand himself through the eyes of others and to justify himself in relation to them because he's been in a state of solitude for so long. Now, here's a little quote about adventure. There are loads of them throughout the text, but here's one. So the autodidact leans towards me, his eyes half closed, and asks, "Have you had many adventures, monsieur?" "A few," I answer mechanically, throwing myself back to avoid his tainted breath. Yes, I said that mechanically without thinking. In fact, I'm generally proud of having had so many adventures, but today I had barely pronounced the words than I was seized with contrition. It seems as though I'm lying, that I've never had the slightest adventure in my life, or rather, I don't even know what the word means anymore. At the same time, I'm weighed down by the same discouragement I had in Hanoi 4 years ago when Mercier pressed me to join him, and I stared at the Khmer statuette without answering. And the idea is there, this great white mass which so disgusted me then. I hadn't seen it for 4 years. So that's the first possibility. Now, there are a whole sense of other ones that maybe we can talk about in the seminar. He considers his possibility of writing history books as justifying his life, but ultimately he realises that the Marquis de Rolleban can't give his life meaning, can't give life to his life, as it were. He can only choose to give life to Rolleban. And in doing so, that involves making a contingent choice of that project. So history can't provide a foundation. He discusses at length the bourgeois ideal of life when he visits Beauvais Museum and he looks at all the paintings. And that involves sort of taking the principles and values in society as if they were absolutes. So we see ourselves as having absolute rights and absolute responsibilities. Now that's a way of overcoming the contingencies of the world. But as you have seen, Requentin sees his response to contingency in this form as, in a sense, a way of deceiving oneself, a form of self-deception. Now we can also consider the autodidact as being a figure who attempts to achieve justification of himself through knowledge. Now, the autodidact shows the limitations of that approach, both because he's quite a pathetic figure, but also because his justification involves a justification through others that's ultimately unsuccessful. The knowledge he has is the knowledge that other people have produced, and so it's a justification on the authority of other people, which ultimately falls away because he's unable, because there's a realization that he has to take up that knowledge himself, and he refuses to do that. Now, there are lots of other modes as well. So there's love, nostalgia, the autodidact humanism, a whole series of ways in which Requentin considers forms of justification for life that ultimately fail. And even suicide. Suicide fails as a response to the absurdity of life. Okay, so we'll talk more about all of these approaches in the seminar. Now, Nausea presents an opening into Sartre's philosophy. But like I said, you should be able to see, or you should have seen, that it hardly deals with our relationships with other people at all. Now, Sartre's later philosophy, one of the things that's going to make it more complicated than this early work, is that he's going to attempt to introduce an understanding of how other people affect our attempts to live in a world that's fundamentally contingent. So that's going to be an account of how our own projects conflict with other people, but also how we can attempt to use other people to save ourselves from this kind of vertiginous feeling we have in the face of the existence of the world. Okay, so that's all I want to talk about today. When we get to the seminars on Thursday, we can also talk about some of the housekeeping for the course, assessments and the like. Yeah, I look forward to seeing you then. Okay, thanks a lot.